corporate world, I decided to indulge a fantasy of being a newspaper columnist, a lifelong fantasy I had. And I started writing columns for a local weekly paper called Our Toronto. Eventually, it morphed into an online newspaper called Canada Free Press. I'd been contributing columns to both newspapers for about 8 years before the door got slammed on me a couple of weeks ago. Well, I guess a month ago. My columns were about anything that caught my fancy. At the beginning, I wrote about local politics, a subject I was well versed in. But I also wrote political commentary about Canada, the US, and other international concerns. I wrote articles about social issues and environmental matters. Over time, there was less local content and more general stuff, and increasingly in the last couple of years, I've been writing on religious issues. It was an opinion column, and I tried to adhere to 3 basic attributes. Not always successfully, of course. They were, make it interesting, make it entertaining, humorous if possible, and make a point. My style is basically to sacrifice content in the interests of clarity. As a lawyer, I was painfully aware of how muddy writing can be. The publisher of Canada Free Press liked my columns and said that their newspaper got a lot of feedback from them. So at this point, I'll bring you up to speed on Canada Free Press. The owner-editor is a woman named Judi McLeod. She's a professional journalist, and by that I mean, like a lot of the professional journalists, she started young and in some out-of-the-way place and worked her way up the journalistic ladder to the big city newspapers. She was writing for the Toronto Sun as an investigative reporter at the advent of her publishing career. The socialists on Toronto City Council, I think it was Councillor Alan Sparrow to be exact, started a weekly newspaper called The Badger. I don't know if any of you remember this, but the right-wing councillors, Tony O'Donoghue and Tom Jacobek, decided they should counter that with a newspaper of their own. So they persuaded McLeod to publish a right-wing weekly, which was called Our Toronto. It was mainly aimed at local politics. The councillors got the funding for it, from where I cannot say, but I'm sure it didn't come out of their pockets. Later, Jacobek and O'Donoghue had a falling out, and McLeod decided to take the paper, find private funding, and launch it as hers. She struggled for many years. However, she eventually abandoned the print format and went online and renamed it Canada Free Press. As time went on, she began to realize that she had a much bigger US readership than Canadian, and she redubbed the paper CFP to downplay its Canadianism. Indeed, over the last couple of years, the number of Canadian columnists contributing pieces has dwindled, and the number of Americans has risen. All of this helped in gaining advertising revenue, and I believe she is beginning to prosper, judging from some of the personal purchases she's recently made and intends to make. I had first met McLeod when I was the CEO of my company, and I gave her a couple of leads on stories that panned out for her, and for which she was very grateful. We were quite friendly and met every so often for lunch to swap war stories. It was natural for me to approach her when I left the corporate world and wanted to exercise my writing muscles. After I became a columnist, we always had one lunch just before Christmas each year. I'd pay for one, she'd pay for the next. Some time went by, and I began to feel a little uncomfortable continually writing for her paper. Now, I have been published elsewhere. I've been published in the Star, and there's another online paper that I've contributed columns to. There were a lot of, but hers was the easiest. I mean, it was inertia, you know. She basically published almost anything I wrote, so it was easy. There were a lot of what I would characterize as out-and-out rants showing up. I consider myself to be a conservative, but not an ideological one. A lot of the stuff that appears in CFP is very ideologically right-wing. I also began to be less enchanted with the idea that the paper was becoming more US-focused and less Canadian. And the third problem was religion. Once you start appealing to American conservatives and right-wingers, you're only a short step away from the evangelical political people, the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robertsons. I consider them to be cranks. I would see columns appearing suggesting that there is substance to the notion of the wrath of God justifying Hurricane Katrina. And what if Falwell and Robertson have it right? I cringed at those. Another was an up-your-nose piece to Muslims saying, my religion, Christianity, is better than your religion really schoolyard stuff. McLeod also saw fit to publish articles condemning Harry Potter books as being evil. I decided to write a piece in defense of Harry, but before I submitted it, I had my annual Christmas lunch with McLeod. I mentioned Harry Potter, but did not tell her I had written a column on it. I saw her back stiffen, and she blathered out something about preferring the classics like Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, etc. Later, I asked her if she was Christian. She said yes. So I self-censored and I didn't send in the piece. Later, I wrote a column commenting on the results of a survey conducted by the U.S. Pew Research Institute that showed American tolerance for torturing prisoners in Guantanamo. The Catholics were most in favor, followed closely by the Protestants, but the atheists were mostly opposed. I made some snarky comments about what you would expect from a church that condoned an inquisition for centuries and another that burned alleged witches at the stake, and followed up with a comment about who would have thought the atheists were the good guys. She never published it, nor did she comment on it. Now, I should tell you there were about 3 times that she didn't publish my stuff. That was one where she never commented on it. I wrote a piece on earlier on George Bush, which was a bit negative. And, I don't know, the material just materialized in front of me. What could I do? When you see an opportunity, you go for it. So anyway, I wrote this piece, I sent it in, and she called me and said, you know, I'm not going to publish this. She said, my readership is really Republican in the United States, and this was when George was still in favor with the Republican Party, and I'm not going to do that. And I said, okay, fine. So I never sent her another bad George Bush story. Another time I wrote one on Omar Khadr in Guantanamo, a Canadian kid in Guantanamo, and basically saying that, you know, I was talking about the international treaty on child soldiers and how the U.S. was a signatory, and what it didn't look like, you know, when their soldiers get killed by child. It's okay if in Africa, Africans kill Africans, but, you know, when child soldiers kill your soldiers, you don't give them a square deal. That was kind of the gist of the piece. She phoned me again and said, well, I'm not going to publish that, and not because I didn't like it or agree with it or anything. It's just that she had written something about the war, and she had the wives of the soldiers who were injured by Omar phone her up and thank her very much for what she wrote. And so she thought it was politically not right to be publishing this kind of defense of Omar that I was doing. So I mentioned that to tell you the relationship we had in terms of what I submitted and what she would, everything else she published. Every column I wrote about Islam, by the way, was published. The last time I dined with McLeod, I mentioned that I wrote a lot of stuff that I didn't send her because I thought it would be material she would not be interested in publishing. And that's true. I mean, about 50% of what I wrote I sent her. She told me to let her be the judge and just send her everything I wrote. So I took her at her word. In June of this year, I submitted a piece criticizing the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party for its proposal to fund faith-based schools and called for the abolition of funding for Catholic schools. I published it, despite being a Catholic, educated in Catholic schools. A few days later, I posted another column answering some of the critics to my first piece. That also was published. Then I saw another one of those Harry Potter is evil columns. And I decided to bite the bullet and send in a defense of Potter and a criticism of Christian evangelicals. I had at that point rented the video, and if you haven't seen it, you should rent it, called Jesus Camp. I don't know if you're familiar with it. And it's Becky Fisher is the evangelical reverend who runs this camp for children and praises Muslims for being able to turn their kids into suicide bombers and wishes she could have that kind of clout. And it's a terrible thing. Anyway, and I was really down on them when I saw that. So I didn't pull any punches. I entitled it Harry Potter and Child Abuse, picking up on the Dawkins and the Hitchens thing about, you know, children shouldn't be subjected to religion too early, claiming that the indoctrination of evangelical children bordered on abuse. Again, it was published, Wonders of Wonders. I really had thought she would draw the line at that one. So I was beginning to think she meant what she said. Anyway, encouraged, I wrote another attack on the progressive conservative policy and led in with ridiculing some religious